society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. It's the 7th of March 2015. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur Event. I'm your host, Walter, coming to you from the Netherlands, where it's 4 p.m., which means it's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And what's up, everybody? How you doing? Today we should continue Larkin Rose's The Most Dangerous Superstition. It talks about the whole idea of authority. And he's breaking it down pretty nicely. So, let's pick this up where we left off. The same attitude and mentality can be seen in various law enforcement actions, such as the assault on Ruby Ridge in 1992, and the raid, standoff, and eventual massacre near Waco, Texas, 1993. Ruby Ridge, 1992. In neither case was authority going after someone who had actually harmed or threatened anyone else. Instead, both events involved paramilitary assault based upon the alleged possession of illegal firearms. In the Waco incident, 80 people, including men, women and children, eventually died after being mentally and physically tortured for weeks with sleep deprivation and CS gas, among other things. The victims were demonized to both the public and those in law enforcement, and the government aggressors exhibited both contempt for their victims and enthusiasm at the thought of killing them. The same general attitude can be seen in dozens of police abuse videos depicting police enthusiastically bullying and even physically assaulting people who are not a threat to anyone, and who are not even fighting back or resisting. This is the direct result of convincing law enforcers that everyone else is beneath them, and that, as agents of authority, they have the right to have anyone else treat them like superiors. Groveling before them and unquestioningly obeying their commands. The same pattern can also be seen among tax collectors and other bureaucrats. To what extent the belief in the authority actually creates sadistic tendencies, and to what extent it simply unleashes tendencies which were already there, hardly matters. The point is that, by pretending to relieve the individual of responsibility for his own actions, and by ordering him to inflict harm on others, and telling him that it is not just permissible but virtuous to harm a particular target, the myth of authority converts millions of average, otherwise decent people into monsters and sadistic agents of evil. Whatever factors normally compel people to behave civilly and non-violently, whether it be the individual's internal virtues, his devotion to oral principles or religious beliefs, or simply his concern about what others might think of him or might do to him, are easily defeated and overridden by the belief in authority. In short, the most effective way to shut down the humanity and decency of any individual is to teach him to respect and obey authority. Next heading, what the badge means. Those who do the bidding of a supposed authority usually go out of their way to make it clear that they are doing so. When a soldier dons his military attire, marches into formation, or gets into a military vehicle, when a cop puts on his uniform and gets into a car marked police, when a plain-clothed government agent, whether from the FBI, IRS, US Marshal, or any other agency, shows his badge or announces his official title, he is making a very specific statement, which can be summed up as follows. I'm not acting as a thinking, responsible, independent human being and should not be treated as such. I'm not personally responsible for my actions because I am not acting from my own free will or my own judgment of right and wrong. I am instead acting as the tool of something superhuman, something with the right to rule you and control you. As such, I can do things that you can't. I have rights that you don't. You must do as I say, submit to my commands and treat me as your superior. Because I am not a mere human being. This is the most dangerous superstition by Larkin Rose, lady. If you put that into Google, you will get this PDF, which I'm reading from. So check it out. The most dangerous superstition, Larkin Rose. Alright, continuing. I have risen above that. Through my unquestioning obedience and loyalty to my masters, I have become a piece of the superhuman entity called authority. As a result, the rules of human morality do not apply to me, and my actions should not be judged by the usual standard of human behavior. Alright. This bizarre, mystical, cult-like belief is held by every law enforcer in the world. It is horribly dangerous for anyone to imagine himself to have an exemption from the basic rules of right and wrong. Yet this is exactly what every agent of government imagines. Despite the fact that soldiers and law enforcers usually display their official uniforms with great pride, what they are actually doing is publicly displaying the fact that they are delusional, have a completely warped and demented view of reality, and have betrayed the very thing that made them human. Their free will and their personal responsibility that goes along with it. Every person who claims, I guess, another typo, every person who claims to act on behalf of authority is demonstrating that he has accepted an utterly ridiculous lie, that his position, his badge, his office dramatically changes what behaviors are moral and what behaviors are immoral. The idea is patently insane, but is rarely recognized as such because even the victims of the enforcers shared in this delusion. Alright. Next heading is Noble Motives, Evil Actions. It is important to again stress the fact that of those who become law enforcers and soldiers, most do so out of a desire to fight for justice. Nonetheless, because of their belief in authority, their noble intentions often end up being used to harm the innocent and protect the guilty. Because a police officer is supposed to enforce the law, and a soldier is supposed to follow orders, their own values and intentions get trumped by the agendas of those given the orders. Notwithstanding the military recruitment propaganda encouraging young men and women to join up to fight for truth and justice, the true job of a soldier is to kill whomever the masters tell him to kill. It is as simple as that. How many Americans would, on their own, choose to go to foreign lands and kill complete strangers? How many Americans, on their own, if they were in a foreign land, would feel justified in going door to door, interrogating strangers at gunpoint, invading and searching their homes because they thought some truly bad people might be in the area? These are actions which almost every individual's sense of morality would tell them are wrong. But when someone voluntarily joins an authoritarian military, he intentionally shuts off his own judgment and conscience in favor of simply doing as he is told. Though soldiers sometimes use legitimate force, such as combating aggressors and invaders, they also routinely act as aggressors and invaders themselves. It would be impossible for a government military to function any other way. Imagine an army going door to door, politely asking each homeowner for permission to cross his land. Simply calling the situation war causes the believers in government to imagine that the usual standard of human behavior do not apply. Under the excuse of necessity, soldiers trespass, steal, intimidate, threaten, assault, interrogate, torture, and murder. And they do this even against people they consider to be their allies. Like the USS Liberty. The military invasion and occupation of Iraq by the mercenaries of the US government, which was purportedly done to defend the people of Iraq, was an example of large-scale aggression and coercion, and thus was immoral, even if it displayed a regime guilty of an even worse level of intimidation and murder, the regime of Saddam Hussein. Yet the supposed evil of the enemy is often cited as the justification for authoritarian coercion. In truth, today and throughout history, large-scale violence against innocents has always been done in the name of fighting for freedom or fighting against injustice. Even when the Nazis invaded Poland, they first staged a series of false flag events and propaganda stunt, collectively known as Operation Himmler, so they could pretend that the invasion was a justifiable act of self-defense. Yeah, you know, the story goes that Poland actually attacked Germany. Now, that doesn't make any sense because Poland had nowhere near the military power that Germany does. So, who would be so stupid, right? The truth is that even when the evil of an enemy regime is easy to see, making the overall fight seem righteous to one side, the violence committed by the authoritarian militaries is never directed only at the actual aggressors on the other side. The structure and methodology of hierarchical armies make it so that innocents are always victimized in one way or another, and not just by accident but by design. The pack mentality that is such a big part of patriotism makes this unavoidable. In World War II, the American troops saw the Krauts and the Japs as the enemy, rather than seeing the enemy as those individuals who actually committed acts of aggression against innocent people. A concept which would require each soldier to constantly use his own individual perception and moral judgment to assess each situation as he confronted it, which is incompatible with an authoritarian chain of command. Of course, of the people who fit the definition of the Krauts, or the Japs, many played no part in the conflict, aside from funding it through paying taxes, as discussed below. But on both sides in every war, government militaries and the propaganda they use always target and demonize a general category of people rather than just the individuals who have actually initiated violence. The result is that huge demographic groups end up being ordered to subjugate or exterminate each other, making it so that neither side is ever the good guy in any war between nations, and both militaries always use violence against innocent people, as well as against other soldiers. Perhaps one of the most heinous examples of this was the dropping of nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which constituted by far the two worst individual acts of terrorism and mass murder in history. Together, they resulted in the deaths of around 200,000 civilians, about 70 times worse than the number of deaths from the 9/11 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. Yes, well, that is true, but 9/11 came to my mind immediately when he was talking about the worst individual acts of terrorism, not because supposedly the Muslims made the 412-meter building story, 412-meter high skyscraper come down in 11 seconds, both of them, but more what happened after it, right? What was the consequence of this? It was an attack on the mind of so many people that they would be okay with their rights, or well, how do you even talk about rights anymore, right? But that they would be okay with their rights being taken away. Because, there's a terrorist under every bed now, So, as far as world-changing events, I would say 9/11 trumps that of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The admitted goal was to inflict fear, pain, and death on the population of an entire country, in order to coerce the ruling class of that country to bend to the will of another ruling class. Ironically, This fits perfectly the United States government's own definition of terrorism, except that the definition conveniently exempts acts that are legal and or committed by governments. If those in government advocate and carry out violent activities that are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, then it is considered legitimate and just. If anyone else does the exact same thing, it's terrorism. See Section 2331, Title 18 of the United States Code. As an aside, the existence of nuclear weapons is entirely the result of the belief in authority. Unlike many weapons, it is impossible to use them for purely defensive purposes. The only reason the nuclear bomb was invented and manufactured in the first place was because of the authoritarian, nationalistic pack mentality idea that it is possible and righteous to be at war with an entire country, and that therefore indiscriminately exterminating thousands of people at once can be justifiable. Being a member of a government Alright, don't get how the sentence is built up, but I'll just read it as it is. Being a member of a government, military requires one to contribute to anti-human acts. Even if only indirectly, regardless of whatever noble motives the individual may have had for joining the armed forces. The reason is simple. Acting based on one's own perception and judgment and abiding by one's own conscience and one's own sense of right and wrong, it is utterly incomparable with being a member of any government military. Sadly, the result is that both sides of every war are wrong and that they both initiate violence against innocents. At the same time, both sides of every war are also right, in that they each condemn the other side for initiating violence against innocents. In short, as long as there are soldiers willing to subjugate themselves to a claimed authority, and even to commit murder when it tells them to, lasting peace will be impossible. Those who fight for any government, even if they believe they are fighting for their country, can never achieve freedom and justice, because the ruling class, by its very nature, never wants freedom and justice, even for its own subjects, or it would cease to exist. However noble their motives and however courageous their actions, ultimately the only thing government soldiers can ever achieve is subjugation and domination. Ironically, probably in an attempt to hide the inherently evil nature of every government military and to distinguish its own mercenaries from the mercenaries of other tyrannical regimes, the US military pretends that American soldiers have the right and duty to disobey any order that they deem to be illegal or immoral. However, not only is any soldier who does so likely to be court-martialed, but such a principle, which by itself would be quite proper, goes directly against the entire concept of authority, and against the specific methods used to train soldiers to be unthinking, obedient tools of the regime they serve. In a combat setting, nearly everything that every government military does constitutes aggressive terrorism, and almost every order a soldier receives is an immoral order, whether it is to trespass on someone else's property, blow up a bridge, block a road, disarm civilians, detain and interrogate people without justification, or kill complete strangers, just on the say-so of a supposed authority. In fact, when the rules of engagement are only to fire if fired upon, then it is still often unjustified. When one is the aggressor, whether individually or acting on behalf of authority, the target of that aggression has the right to use whatever force is necessary to stop the aggressor. In other words, in a lot of situations, shooting at soldiers, including American soldiers, is inherently justified. Killing someone for defending himself against aggressors is murder, even when the aggressors are US soldiers. And almost every soldier routinely commits immoral acts of aggression, believing that commands from authority make it okay for him to do so. If any soldier actually took seriously the idea that he had a duty to disobey an immoral order, the first thing he would do would be to quit the military. Those who act as mercenaries for government, even if they do so with the best intentions, will always be part of a machine that commits aggression as often as, or more often than that, it defends the innocent. That being the case, nearly every combat soldier does things which would justify the use of defensive violence against him. However, as conquering invaders always have, the US military commanders label anyone who resists their acts of aggression as an enemy combatant, an insurgent or terrorist. When aggression is committed in the name of authority, many then view any act of self-defense against such aggression as a sin. As much as American authoritarians might be outraged at the suggestion, the truth is that many thousands of people the world over have had good cause to shoot at American soldiers. When a person who has not harmed or threatened anyone in his own home, minding his own business, and heavily armed thugs break through his door, point machine guns at him and his family, threatening and ordering them around, the homeowner has the absolute right to protect himself and his family by any means necessary, including killing the armed intruders. The average American, if he were the victim of such an assault by foreign mercenaries, would feel perfectly justified in using whatever violence was necessary to repel the attackers. But if his fellow Americans were the ones committing such assault in a foreign land, that same American, having been steeped in authority, worship, and pack mentality, will support the troops, and will cheer when American soldiers murder a homeowner who attempts to forcibly resist such aggression and thuggery. Authoritarian military actions are never purely defensive. When governments declare war, it is never to defend the innocent or to preserve freedom, though that is always the stated purpose. When governments engage in war, it is always to protect or add to the territory or other resources controlled by that government. The ruling class, by its very nature, does not even want its own subjects to be free, much less the subjects of some foreign ruler. As a result, though one who dies in combat is often said to have given his life for his country, in reality, those who die in war are simply resources spent by tyrants in various turf wars with other competing gangs of tyrants. The people are fed propaganda about heroism, sacrifice, raw patriotism. Rod is supposed to probably be and. To hide the fact that governments never enter war to serve justice or freedom. They do it to serve their own power. An objective examination of history makes this obvious. Even one of the most apparently justifiable military endeavors in history, the Allies in World War II fighting against the Axis powers, while it resulted in the defeat of the third Well, if he says so. I was thinking it was gonna read the Third Reich, right? But it says, while it resulted in the defeat of the third worst mass murderer in history, Adolf Hitler, it also resulted in the worst mass murderer in history, Joseph Stalin, essentially being given half of Europe by the rulers of the Allied nations. The motive of most of the American soldiers who fought in the war was undoubtedly to protect the good from the evil, but the motives of those who commanded them, and therefore the actual result of the brave soldiers' efforts, was nothing more than authoritarian conquest and power. Yeah. That's odd. Yeah, I got my own ideas about this ending of the World War. World War II, that is. I just don't think that it's a coincidence that Russia and the Allied forces happened to just arrive at Berlin at the same time. I think that was planned that way. I think it was planned that Russia would be taking over these parts of Europe and that a Cold War was already known going to happen, right? So I think this is all planned, to be honest with you. There's also a movie out, a documentary about the Russian side of the war. And Stalin, apparently, that's the story that they portray, right? Didn't have great trust in any of his generals. And one of the generals who was very well trained in military conquest, he was actually getting ahead. If Stalin had let him go, he would have captured Berlin on his own, right? But Stalin told him, no, you have to stop now. Stay where you are, right? So, that's suspicious to me, right? That's how Berlin got split up. So, anyway, continuing. In World War II, one could have at least suggested, with some imagination, the possibility of an invasion of the United States, and thereby claim that it was an act of self-defense because national security was at stake. But most United States military operations have involved no direct threat at all to the US. Wrong intonation. 30-some thousand Americans died in the Korean War. No one imagined that North Korea was going to invade the United States. 50-some thousand Americans died in the Vietnam War. No one imagined that North Vietnam was going to invade the United States. No one imagined that the armies of Iraq or Afghanistan were going to invade the United States. The excuse for such conflicts has always been a vague cause such as fighting communism, or even the more ethereal excuse of having a war on terror, which is made more ironic by the fact that terrorist tactics were and continue to be routinely used by United States forces. The sad irony is that American ruling class, because of the legitimacy its victims imagine it to have, is the only gang actually capable of conquering and subjugating the American people. The gigantic military machine and all of the war games it has engaged in, rather than providing a shred of real protection for the American public, is what created most existing foreign threats, and what is still used as the excuse to justify the oppression of Americans by their own government via the Orwellian-named Patriot Act. Yeah, among other things. The popular bumper sticker that says, "If you love your freedom, thank a veteran," is a continuing symptom of the pack mentality, state-worshipping propaganda that ruling classes feed to their subjects, so that the masters will continue to have pawns to play in their sadistic, destructive power games. Even when a slave master fights to prevent some other slave master from stealing his slaves, he is still no friend of the slaves themselves. It is quite understandable that someone who has risked his life, gone through hell, harmed or killed other human beings, possibly including innocents, and suffered physical or emotional trauma as a result, would be reluctant to accept that all his courage, his suffering, and the damage he inflicted on others ultimately served only the schemes of megalomaniacs. However, even some of the most famous military personalities in history has eventually come to acknowledge that governments engage in war not for any noble purpose but for profits and power. Major General Smedley Butler, who at the time of his death in 1940 was the most decorated US Marine in history, wrote a book titled "War is a Racket," that criticized the military-industrial complex, saying that war is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many, even going so far as to describe his own military service as the actions of a high-class muscle man, a racketeer and a gangster. Likewise, General Douglas MacArthur made the opinion that military expansion is driven by an artificially induced psychosis of war hysteria and an incessant propaganda of fear. General MacArthur also said the following: "The powers in charge keep us in a perpetual state of fear, keep us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it by furnishing the exorbitant sums demanded. Yet in retrospect, these disasters seem never to have happened, never seem to have been quite real." Of course, to criticize war as a racket which benefits only the ruling class is not to say that the ruling class on the other side is not also evil, or should not be resisted. The atrocities committed by the enforcers of the regimes of Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Lenin, Pol Pot, and many others were extremely serious, and the use of the defensive violence against the acts of aggression committed by the agents of such regimes was certainly justified. But authoritarian warfare pits pawn against pawn in a large-scale bloody combat which covers huge geographical areas, always victimizing civilian populations in the process, while the ruling class on both sides watch from a safe distance. Further evidence that war is never about ideals or principles is the fact that the US government has often waged war against tyrants it put into place, such as Manuel Noriega and Saddam Hussein. An even more blatant example of how war is not about principles is the fact that at the beginning of World War II, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union were sworn enemies of the United States. By the end of the war, the psychotic mass murder was referred to as Uncle Joe by the United States government propagandist and was treated as a noble ally. Yeah. Always been at war with Oceania, right? Stalin's crime against humanity, resulting in tens of millions of deaths, were largely unmentioned in the United States at the time. In light of that fact, it is absurd to claim that the United States government decided to enter World War II based on any moral principle or to defeat evil. It is important to note what does and what does not occur in traditional international warfare. Competing ruling classes, yeah, I wonder, this is just me talking, right? I wonder if that even exists. Competing ruling classes. I'm suspicious that these so-called ruling classes all over the world, they work together, you know? Anyway, competing ruling classes, including the American rulers, so who would that be? You gotta wonder, who are these American rulers, right? When you have the Royal Institute of International Affairs, who has a seat in London, having his dependance, you guys know that word? In the form of the CFR, who decides which puppets are going to be performing in the political stage. Who's really the puppet master, right? Okay, let's try this again. Competing ruling classes, including the American rulers, are content to watch their respective pawns slaughtering each other by the thousands. But it had long been the official policy of many governments, including the United States government, not to attempt to kill foreign rulers. Yeah, that's another sign, clue, that makes you think, what's going on here, right? The one most responsible, those are the ones, apparently, that are most responsible for making the war happen. In truth, the most moral, the most rational, and the most cost-effective means of defense against any invading authority is the assassination of those who command it. Targeting governments instead of their loyal enforcers would serve humanity wonderfully, not only ending most violent conflicts a lot more quickly, but creating a huge deterrent to any megalomaniac tempted to start conflicts in the first place. Yet there is an open, mutual standing agreement between the most high-level tyrants that, while it is okay to play games with the lives of their subjects, they will rarely target each other, right? So what does that tell you? And so, over and over again, huge numbers of soldiers march out into battlefields to kill each other while the real enemies of humanity, the rulers on both sides, remain out of harm's way. Thus, the lives of the well-intentioned soldiers, the brave government enforcers, who loyally follow orders to the bitter end, are utterly wasted in endeavors which, by design, ultimately achieve real freedom and justice for no one. And if a soldier manages to recognize and target the ones most responsible for injustice and oppression, those who wear the label of government on both sides of every war, he is condemned as a traitor and a terrorist. Alright, that was the end of that heading. Moving on to the next, which is called Proudly Committing Evil. Whether it is a soldier or some low-level bureaucrat, the job of all law enforcers is to forcibly inflict the will of the ruling class upon the general public. Nonetheless, most imagine that as they do so, they are serving the people. Of course, the idea of serving someone by initiating violence against him is ridiculous. Consider the oxymoron of the absurdly named Internal Revenue Service. Which does nothing but rob hundreds of millions of people of trillions of dollars every year. Do you guys also call it military service? That word service, if you translate that into Dutch, you get the word dienst, which is the exact same word used to describe people being forced into the military. They call that service. That was at the time that I was like 16, and some years after that. You had to come to some kazerne. I don't know what that is in English. It's a place where the military are, and you had to be tested. And if you passed the test, then you had to join the military for 18 months or so. It wasn't voluntary as it is today. Right? But they call that service. Yeah, you have to join the service. Yeah. Rather than ever considering the possibility that what they do on a regular basis, participating in a system of aggression and coercion, is immoral and uncivilized, most state mercenaries, from the paper pusher to the hired killer, simply say that they are just doing their job, and imagine that absolves them of all personal responsibility for their actions and the result of those actions. This, above all else, has been the downfall of human society, Most of the evil and injustice committed by human beings is not the result of greed or malice or hatred. It is the result of people doing what they are told, people following orders, people doing their jobs. In short, most of man's inhumanity to man is a direct result of the belief in authority. The damage done by the merely obedient is just as real and just as destructive as if they had each done it from personal malice. Whether an old lady is robbed by an armed street thug or by a well-dressed, well-educated tax collector makes no difference, morally or in practical terms. When a family in Iraq is killed by soldiers of Saddam Hussein or by soldiers of the United States government makes no difference, morally or in practical terms. Whether someone's personal choices are coercively controlled by a neighborhood thug or by the police makes no difference. The only difference is that the authoritarian thug, as a result of his delusional belief in the mythical entity called government, refuses to accept personal responsibility for his own actions. His belief in the most dangerous superstition renders him unable to recognize evil as evil. In fact, he will feel proud of his loyal obedience to his masters as he spends day after day inflicting hardship and suffering upon innocent people, because he has been taught for all of his life that when evil becomes law, it ceases to be evil and becomes good. In truth, if anything is a sin, it is blind obedience to authority. Acting as an enforcer for government amounts to spiritual suicide, actually worse than physical suicide, because every authoritarian enforcer not only shuts off the free will and ability to judge, which makes him human, thus killing his own humanity, but also leaves his body intact, to be used by tyrants as a tool for oppression. Alright. In Dutch we would say, steek die maar in je zak. Zo van, that's a strong argument. Right? To be a law enforcer is to willingly change one's self from a person into a robot. A robot which is then given to some of the most evil people in the world, to be used to dominate and subjugate the human race. Wearing the uniform of a soldier or the badge of a law enforcer is not a reason for pride. It should be cause for great shame and having forsaken one's own humanity in favor of becoming a pawn of oppressors. Part 3c. The effects of the myth on the targets. Next heading is proud to be robbed. One of the most bizarre results in the belief in authority is that it causes the victims of government aggression to feel obligated to be victimized, and causes them to feel bad if they avoid being victimized. A prime example is the citizen who proclaims that he is proud to pay his taxes, even if one believes that some of what he surrenders is used to fund useful things, roads, helping the poor, etc. To be proud of having been threatened and coerced into funding such thing is still strange. Pride in being a law-abiding taxpayer is not the result of having helped people, which the person could have done far more effectively on a voluntary basis. The pride comes from having faithfully obeyed the commands of a perceived authority. By analogy, a man may feel good about having freely given to someone in need, but he would not take pride in getting robbed by a poor man. Probably the only situation in which anyone brags about having been forced to do something occurs in the context of one who believes he is obligated to obey a perceived authority. Having been trained to view obedience as a virtue, people want to feel good about surrendering what they earn to government. And so, with the help of a political propaganda, they hallucinate that their contributions are actually helping society as a whole. They speak as if paying taxes means giving back to society or investing in the country. Such rhetoric, as common as it is logically nonsensical, since it implies that every one of the individuals who make up society and the country somehow each owes a debt to the group as a whole, but is owed nothing. What people are actually doing when they pay taxes is giving money not to society or the country, but to the politician who makes up the ruling class. Yeah. To spend however they please. Well, no. I would say is given money not to society or the country, but to the puppets in Washington, D.C., who are put there in place by the ruling class to spend the money according to the wishes of the lobbyists. Right, that's how I would have put that, but it's okay, Larkin. The implication, as odd as it is that people can benefit a whole by every one of the people being robbed individually. Yeah, how does that make sense, right? The idea that the common good is better served by politicians spending everyone's money than it would be served by each person spending his own money is strange, to say the least. Recently, the lie of taxes serving the common good has become more and more transparent as governments have spent astronomical amounts of money on things which obviously serve the elite at the expense of the society and humanity. This would include perpetual warmongering, direct multi-billion-dollar redistribution schemes benefiting the richest people in the world, right? Bailouts, and government takeovers of various segments of the economy, like healthcare industry, among other things. In fact, there is almost nothing average people could financially support that would be less helpful to society and humanity in general than paying taxes. Whatever things a person views as worthwhile, schools, roads, defense, helping the poor, etc., he could just as easily support without going through politicians and government. Yet many people specifically express pride for having surrendered the fruits of their labor to their masters, having paid their taxes. Consider how someone would be viewed who proudly proclaimed, "I lied on my tax return, avoided giving $3,000 to the government and gave the $3,000 to a really good charity instead." Alright. Blah blah. Let's see what we can find. on the YouTube. Let's see. This is half an hour, it's a bit too long. This is only 3 minutes something. But we're gonna have a little musical break and let you guys enjoy Poker Face. So, here we go. That was Poker Face. I find this like more of a coincidence that on this YouTube site you can find this video, right? But there's always when you... I'll put this one in the chat so you guys can check what I'm about to tell you. Right? If you you click that video that I just pasted in the chat room, the song will start playing, right? And then at the right side, there is more that you can click there, and then more videos. But they are different for you than they are for me. Why is that? Because it says here, especially for you, to this video that is called The Complete and Undeniable Truth. And guess who is the author of that? It's Larkin Rose. Right? So, YouTube is just spying on people, right? Interesting. Alright, I got my coffee. And I need to roll a cigarette. Let's see, do I have some tobacco? That's an old video, lady. Alright. Yeah, I mean, they've been around for quite some time, haven't they? So, yeah, I guess there could be some oldies in there. Yep. So, how are you guys holding out in the United States? I hear it's been kinda cold over there. Snowy and stuff. Yeah, it must be global warming, right? Did you also hear that NASA confirmed findings by the Chinese that the South Pole is actually growing? Must be global warming, right? Yeah. So anyway, they don't use that term global warming much anymore. They got a new term for that. Newspeak, everybody, newspeak. Climate change, right? So, let's see. I'm going to click this by Larkin Rose and put that into chat as well, because it's probably very good. And you should have a look at this if you like. Put that in the chat also. There you go. Yeah, Road puts another one in the chat room that I've seen before. It's called I'm Allowed to Rob You. Right? I said this last week, but I think it's important to repeat. So, like, would you go to your neighbor and say, give me money? You wouldn't, right? Normally speaking. Because you normal people would say, well, that's stealing, right? But what then do? You vote for somebody, and then he, in your name, goes to your neighbor and says, give me money, and now you feel okay? Does that make any sense? Alright, so where were we? Continuing with Larkin Rose's PDF here. Many people would still condemn such a person for his criminal disloyalty to the masters, even if the person's actions better served humanity than paying his taxes would have. This is because the pride expressed by many people does not come from helping humanity, but from obeying authority. There is little or no chance that anyone would voluntarily contribute his own wealth to every one of the programs and schemes now funded via government. And if he hands over money only because some law or other authority compelled him to, and then expressed pride in having doing so, he is in essence boasting about having been forcibly dominated, precisely the way a thoroughly indoctrinated slave might take pride in serving his master well. There is a big difference between feeling good about having voluntarily supported some worthy cause and taking pride in being subjugated. Instead of being offended at the insult and injustice of being coercively controlled and exploited, in fact, instead of even recognizing that, as many victims of government's oppression feel, profound loyalty to their controllers. Next heading is called Proud to be Controlled. If a slave can be convinced that he should be a slave, then his enslavement is both proper and legitimate, that he is the rightful property of his master, and that he has an obligation to produce as much as possible for his master. Then he does not need to be physically oppressed. In other words, enslaving the mind makes enslaving the body unnecessary. And that is exactly what the belief in authority does. It teaches people that it is morally virtuous that they surrender their time, effort and property, as well as their freedom and control over their own lives to a ruling class. Many people express pride at being law-abiding taxpayers, which means only that they do what the politicians tell them to do, and give the politicians money. When confronted with the idea that it is wrong for them to be forcibly deprived of the fruits of their labor, even if it is done legally, such people often vehemently defend those who continue to rob them, insisting that such robbery is essential to human civilization. Of course, they do not use the term robbery to describe the situation, though they are well aware of what would be done to them if they refuse to pay. Likewise, when one person objects to the level of taxation or other forcible control being inflicted upon him by those in government, others who are also being oppressed will often condemn the one who is objecting, telling him that if he does not like how he is being treated, he should leave the country. Yeah. Maligning a fellow victim of coercion for complaining about it is sure sign that a person actually takes pride in his own enslavement. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, witnessed and described that exact phenomena among his fellow slaves, many of whom were proud of how hard they worked for their masters and how faithfully they did as they were told. From their perspective, a runaway slave was a shameful thief, having stolen himself from the master. Douglass described how thoroughly indoctrinated many slaves were, to the point where they truly believed that their own enslavement was just and righteous. Alright. And it goes quotes open. So apparently this Douglass is saying this. I have found that to make a content slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision and, as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. Is that why the original title of 1984 was actually The Last Man? So, it says here, he must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. Well, he probably does detect them, but then he uses doublethink. Alright? You should all know what doublethink is. If you don't, go read 1984. Though slavery is no longer practiced openly, the mentality of loyal subservience remains. Most people today detect no inconsistencies in allowing a ruling class to forcibly extort and control everyone else, and in fact feel that such extortion and oppression is right, to the point where many feel actual shame if they are caught keeping what they earn and running their own lives. It is one thing to feel shame at having been caught stealing, or defrauding, or committing aggression. But it is quite another for someone to feel shame about having done something which, if not for politicians' degrees, laws, he would have seen as perfectly permissible. Such shame does not come from the immorality of the act itself, it comes only from the imagined immorality of disobeying authority, by breaking the law. When, for example, the average citizen is caught cheating on his taxes, or not having a registration sticker on his car, or smoking marijuana, or doing any one of 1,000 other things which do not constitute aggression against anyone else, but which have nonetheless been declared illegal by the ruling class, there is usually some feeling of guilt in the person's own mind. Without the feeling of being obligated to obey, being caught and punished by agents of governments would be regarded in the same way that being bitten by a dog would be regarded, as an unpleasant consequence to be avoided, but having no moral element to it at all. Instead, most people feel, at least to some extent, that being caught by committing a victimless crime indicates some sort of moral failing in themselves, because they did not do as they were told. The desire to have the approval of authority is extremely powerful in almost everyone, to a degree they themselves do not even realize. The ubiquitous message of authoritarianism has a psychological impact far deeper than most people imagine, as the Milgram experiments demonstrated. Nearly everyone experiences dramatic emotional stress and discomfort anytime he comes into conflict with authority. Yeah, I was reading Contact, right? And will go to great length no matter what acts of evil he must commit in order to earn the approval of his masters. Even the terminology people use illustrate how effectively they have been trained to feel morally obligated to obey authority. Right? Another way of putting this sentence. Even the terminology people use illustrate how effectively they have been mind-controlled. This can be seen in such simple phrases as, "You're not allowed to do that," or even, "You can't do that," when referring to some behavior that has been declared illegal by the ruling class. Such phrases do not simply express a potential adverse consequence, but also imply that, because some act has been forbidden by the masters, committing that act is bad, not allowing, or even impossible. Some people say that. You can't do that. Well, actually you can. Total disconnect from reality, right? Or just using the word can in a way that is invalid. Looking at the statistical facts demonstrates the power of the belief in authority. In the United States, about 100,000 IRS employees extort about 200 million victims. Those being robbed outnumber the robber by about 2,000 to 1. This could never be accomplished by brute force alone. It continues only because most of those being robbed feel a duty to be robbed, and imagine such robberies to be legitimate and valid. The same is true of many other laws, which are generally obeyed even though the enforcers are always hugely outnumbered by those they seek to control. The high levels of compliance do not come so much from a fear of punishment as from the feeling among those being controlled that they have a moral obligation to cooperate with their own subjugation. Next heading is called The Good Funding the Evil. Even if an individual is never personally victimized by law enforcement, never has a run-in with the police, and sees little, if any, direct impact by government upon his day-to-day life, the myth of authority still has a dramatic impact, not only on his life, but also on how his existence affects the world around him. For example, the millions of compliant subjects who feel an obligation to surrender a portion of what they earn to the state to pay their fair share of taxes, continually fund all manner of endeavors and activities which those people would not otherwise fund, which almost no one would otherwise fund, and which therefore would not otherwise exist. By way of taxes, those claiming to be government confiscate an almost incomprehensible amount of time and effort from millions of victims and convert it to fuel for the agenda of the ruling class. Yep. To wit, millions of people who oppose war are compelled to fund it via taxation. The product of their time and effort is used to make possible something they morally oppose. The same is true of state-controlled wealth redistribution programs. Brackets open, welfare. Brackets close. Ponzi schemes, aka Social Security, the so-called war on drugs, and so on. Most of the programs of government would not exist if not for the belief among the general population in a moral obligation to pay one's taxes. Even government programs purported to have noble goals, such as protecting the public and helping the poor, become bloated, inefficient and corrupt monstrosities which almost no one would willingly support if there was no law requiring them to do so. In addition to the waste, corruption and destructive things which government does with the wealth it confiscates, there is also the less obvious issue of what people would have done with their money otherwise. As government takes the wealth of the producers to serve its own purposes, it also deprives the producers of the ability to further their own goals. Someone who surrenders $1,000 in taxes to the ruling class may not only be funding a war he morally opposes, but he is also being deprived of the ability to put $1,000 into savings or donate $1,000 to some charity he considers worthwhile, or pay someone $1,000 to do some landscaping work. So the damage done by the myth of authority is twofold. It forces people to fund things they do not believe are good for themselves or society, while simultaneously preventing them from funding things that they do view as worthwhile. In other words, subservience to authority causes people to act in a manner which is, to one extent or another, directly opposed to their own priorities and values. Even the people who imagine that their tax dollars are doing good by building roads, helping the poor, paying for police and so on, would almost certainly not fund the government version of those services, at least not to the same degree, if they did not feel compelled by moral obligation and the threat of punishment to do so. Any private charity that had the inefficiency, corruption and record of abuse that AFDC, I have no clue what that is, HUD, also no clue what that is, Medicare and other government programs have, would quickly lose all of its donors. Any private company as expensive, corrupt and inefficient as government infrastructure programs would lose all of its customers. Any private protection service which was so often caught abusing, assaulting and even killing unarmed innocent people would have no customers. Any private company that claimed to be providing defense but told its customers it needed $1 billion every week to wage a prolonged war on the other side of the world would have few, if any, contributors, including among those who now verbally support such military operations. The feeling of obligation to pay taxes seems to be little hampered by the fact that government is notoriously wasteful and inefficient. While millions of taxpayers struggle to make ends meet while paying their fair share of taxes, politicians waste millions on laughably silly projects, even from studying cow farts to building bridges to nowhere, to paying farmers to not grow certain crops, and so on, ad infinitum, and billions more are simply lost, with no accounting of where they went. But much of what people make possible through paying of taxes is not just wasted, but is quite destructive to society. The war on drugs is an obvious example. How many people would voluntarily donate to a private organization which had the stated goal of dragging millions of non-violent individuals away from their friends and families to be put in cages? Even the many Americans who now recognize the war on drugs as a complete failure continue, via taxes, to provide the funding which allows it to continue to destroy literally millions of lives. Even the most vocal critics of the various abuses being perpetrated by the ever-growing police state are often among those making that abuse possible, by providing the funding for it. Whether the issue is a blatant oppression, or corruption, or mere bungling bureaucratic inefficiency, everyone can point to at least a few things about government that do not meet with his approval. And yet, having been trained to obey authority, he will continue to feel obligated to provide the funding which enables the same bungling, corrupt, oppressive government activities that he criticizes and opposes. Rarely does anyone notice the obvious inherent contradiction in feeling obligated to fund things that he thinks are bad. Of course, people who work for non-authoritarian organizations can also be inefficient or corrupt, but when it comes to light that what they are doing, their customers can simply stop funding them. That is the natural correction mechanism in human interaction, but it is completely defeated by the belief in authority. How many people are there who are not currently being forced to fund some government program or activity that they morally oppose? Alright, so who are not, I don't get the sentence. How many people are there who are not currently being forced to fund some government program or activity that they morally oppose? I get it. Very few, if any. So why do those people keep funding things which they feel are destructive to society? Because authority tells them to, and because they believe that it is good to obey authority. As a result, they continue to surrender the fruits of their labor to fuel the machine of oppression, a machine which otherwise would not and could not exist. Yeah, did you watch that video, lady? If I remember correct, he's making very strange arguments, right? But I'm guessing that that's what you're supposed to see. I don't know. Governments produce no wealth. What they spend, they first take from someone else. Every government includes the most oppressive regime in history. Every government, including the most oppressive regimes in history, had been funded by the payment of taxes, by loyal, productive subjects. Thanks to the belief in authority, the wealth created by billions of people will continue to be used not to serve the values and priorities of the people who worked to produce it, but to serve the agendas of those who, above all else, desire dominion over their fellow men. The Third Reich the Third Reich was made possible by millions of German taxpayers who felt an obligation to pay up. Yeah, is that so? The Soviet Empire was made possible by millions of people who felt an obligation to give to the state whatever it demanded. Every invading army, every conquering empire has been constructed out of wealth that was taken from productive people. Got a bit of trouble here with that sentence. Third Reich was made possible by millions of German taxpayers who felt an obligation to pay up. Really? I thought it had more to do with the World War I. You know, and the Treaty of Versailles. The destroyers have always been funded by the creators. Huh? What does that mean? The destroyers have always been funded by the creators. Are the creators in the sense that the productive people? I'm like, is that so? Is that so? Let's see. I'm gonna do a Google search, guys. See what I can come up with. Funding Nazi Germany. Yes. Yeah. Well, this is an example I can give, which is very well known by most people. American Free Press, by Michael Collins Piper, probably somebody you guys all know. Some American Free Press readers were upset by the first two articles in this series, reflecting on the proliferation of myths, phony documents and fraudulent quotations, muddying serious research into the big business of the current day and events of the past. Alright, let's see what's going on here. This week we take a look at one particular ubiquitous myth, a combination of myths which has excited many. A variety of claims that Bush, Rockefeller and Rothschild family and a host of Jewish bankers together or independently helped finance Hitler's rise to power. Yeah. The most cited source for this story, Jewish bankers paved the way for Hitler, is Hitler's Secret Bakers, supposedly by a Jewish banker named Sidney Warburg. Alright, Sidney Warburg. Sidney Warburg. Google. Paste. Enter. Let's see. Warburg family. Blah, 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 blah. Warburg family. Yes, yes, yes. Let's see. The Warburg family is a prominent American family and finance dynasty of German Jewish descent, noted for their varied accomplishments in biochemistry, botany, political activism, economics, investment banking, law, physics, classical music, art history, pharmacology, psychology, finance, private equity, and philanthropy. Alright? So, all I was trying to do is point out that banks play a role in the economic well-being of a country. Right? It's not only the people. Alright? That's the only thing I wanted to point out here. So... Now what? Getting freaked out reactions in the chat. No sound? Or what? Yeah. Okay then, there we go. Thank you. Okay. So let me continue with Clark and Rose's most dangerous superstition. The next heading is digging their own grave. Sadly, the belief in authority even makes people feel obligated to assist in their own enslavement, oppression and sometimes death. In fact, only a small percentage of the coercion of government is implemented by the enforcers of authority. Most of it is implemented by its victims. The ruling class merely tells people that they are required to do certain things, and most people comply without any actual enforcement taking place. As one impressive example, tens of millions of Americans every year fill out lengthy, confusing forms known as tax returns, essentially extorting themselves. If the victims of the IRS agreed to pay, but only if the government figured out that their alleged tax liabilities, the system would collapse. Alright, I'm probably reading that sentence wrong because it doesn't make any sense to me. Every tax return is basically a signed confession, which, with the victim of the extortion racket not only revealing everything about his finances, essentially interrogating himself, but also even figuring out the amount he will be robbed, so the thieves do not have to. But all the unproductive and unpleasant inconveniences and bureaucratic hassles that people subject themselves to, simply because they were told that the law requires it, are nothing compared to the more serious symptoms of the belief in authority. Based upon the mythology about duty to country and the laws imposing military conscription, the draft, right? That's what you guys call it, the draft. Millions of people throughout history have become murderers for the state. Only a small fraction, so-called draft dodgers, ever resisted, and they have usually been despised by their fellow countrymen for being cowards or for lacking patriotism. Alright, my voice is breaking up a bit. In the case, hold on guys. Oh, blah, blah. Yeah. Grabbing some new tobacco. In the case of many laws, it can be difficult to distinguish between people who obey simply because of a simple fear of punishment and those who obey out of a feeling of moral obligation to bow to the commands of the politicians. With military conscription, however, it is easy to tell the difference because compliance is usually far more dangerous than any punishment government threatens against those who refuse to comply. If the choices are to comply and possibly die a gruesome death on some battlefield on the other side of the world, or to disobey and possibly go to prison, it is unlikely that the threat alone is why so many people register and show up for duty when called. In short, the level of compliance with the draft, at least in the past, shows clearly that most people would rather commit murder or die than disobey authority. Right? Another very strong point. There could hardly be a better indication of just how powerful the superstition of authority is. That thousands upon thousands of otherwise civilized, peaceful human beings will leave home, sometimes traveling halfway around the world, to kill or die, simply because their respective ruling classes told them to. It's insane, isn't it? Every soldier is both an enforcer and a victim of the superstition of authority, whether he volunteered or was drafted. Fighting to defend innocents against aggressors is a noble cause, and is often the intention of those who join the military. Yeah. You know, that could even be justified if the United States was under attack. Or, United States has had a history of being invaded. I'm laughing at myself now because, what happened there again in 1776, Anyway. But in an hierarchical military regime, the soldier becomes a tool of the machine rather than a responsible individual. Rather than being guided by his own conscience, he is controlled entirely by the orders he receives through the chain of command. And every time his obedience leads him to do something immoral, which is quite often, not only harms his victims, but he also harms himself. After the Vietnam War, as one example, many American soldiers came home with their bodies intact, but with deep psychological problems. How much of the mental damage was a result of witnessing carnage, and how much was the result of personally creating carnage is difficult to say. A prolonged fear of imminent death can, of course, cause serious psychological problems, and as can inflicting death upon others. Is that so, Rode? Then I'm missing some part of the story. Could you enlighten me? And type something or so that I can read? Rhodes says 1776 was the second chapter of the hoax. So what was the first then? Could you enlighten me there? Violent confrontation can be quite stressful, even when the individual feels entirely justified, such as when defending his family from an attacker. But to engage in mortal combat, where no one, including the combatants, seem to have any clear idea what the purpose or justification for the conflict is, as occurred in Vietnam, seems to add an additional degree of psychological trauma. As many combat soldiers have attested to, once in the hell of war, any vague but noble cause or justification for the fight is usually forgotten, and all that is left is the desire to stay alive and to help one's friends stay alive. And then dash, yeah, that's right, wrote. I say that's right. Let's say, yes, I've heard that before. That there were more presidents before Washington, who was claimed to be the first, right? Let's see. I'm going to use Google again. First American president, George Washington. The article is about the first president of the United States. Yeah, which is that true, right? Is the question. And the source for that claim comes from wikipedia.org. But are there more? Yeah, I haven't dug into that story, wrote. I just heard that he was not the first. Yeah. And that thing about, that bugs me. And this is from Larkin Rose, you know. The Constitution apparently gave the right to tax. What was it, like 2% or something? So, how is it, you know, that you can give something that you don't have yourself? Right? You don't go to your neighbor and say, well, I'm going to impose a 2% tax on you. So how can somebody that represents you have that right? Does that make any sense? Were the people that wrote the Constitution, did they have the right to tax you? If not, how can they write an article which makes it okay for the federal government to tax you? Right? It's nonsensical. Thanks, Rode. Okay, where were we? Here's one of many links. Early presidents. Blah, blah. Peyton Randolph, Henry Middleton, Peyton Randolph, second time, John Hancock, Charles Thompson, Henry Lawrence, John Jay, Samuel Huntington. Alright. First Continental Congress, I'm guessing that is supposed to say. Let's see. Yes. So Randolph and Middleton, First Continental Congress, and then the other are Second Continental Congress. So is that with a flag with a cross in it? In 1775, it was decided that Congress should also appoint a commander-in-chief to command the United States Armed Forces. There was some talk of giving the President of Congress this job, but it was instead decided that the two positions should be separate. Oh. Yeah. Alright. Why is this also controversial? Like many bits of obscure trivia, there has been a tendency for people who are aware of the pre-Washington presidents to inflate the historical relevance of this information as a way of showing off. You'll sometimes hear fringe wannabe historians make a big fuss about the first 10 presidents of the United States and bemoan the fact that no one knows anything about them. There's a guy on the internet, for example, who sells commemorative coins of the articles of Confederation presidents in an effort to rehabilitate their reputation. Alright, interesting. Back to the chat room. They were the leaders of the Continental Congress, says Lady. Yes. Alright. Let's see, we got 9 more minutes, guys. Where were we? Here we were, this sentence. Let's try this again. As many combat soldiers have attested to, once in the hell of war, any vague but noble cause or justification for the fight is usually forgotten. And all that is left is the desire to stay alive and to help one's friends stay alive, both of which are served much better by going home or by not joining the military in the first place. And yet the number of people who simply walk away is quite small, for one simple reason, because it would constitute an act of disobedience to a perceived authority. And the average soldier, though he may have the courage and strength to throw himself into mortal combat, does not have the courage and strength to disobey a perceived authority. As in many cases of authoritarian coercion, the victims of military conscription almost always far outnumber those trying to implement it. Even when people are legally commanded to sacrifice their minds and bodies for the sake of turf wars between tyrants, simple passive disobedience by any significant portion of draftees would make the war machine grind to a halt. What punishment is there to fear that is worse than the result of compliance? The usual result of fighting in a war are prolonged terror, physical and mental pain and suffering, dismemberment or death. Nonetheless, even after witnessing the horrors of war firsthand, very few people can bring themselves to disobey authority, take off the uniform and walk away. A testament to the power of the belief in authority is well documented, if seldom discussed, fact by the atrocities committed against German Jews by the Nazis were often carried out with the cooperation and assistance of Jewish police. Such as occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto. Yeah. This reminds me of the Dutch, when the Germans broke their promise to not invade us. The people in the communities which had a list of all citizens, where they were, where they lived, what their job was, and so on, willingly gave this list to the Germans so that the Germans could pick out which ones were Jewish. In their culture, just as in almost every other culture, the people had been so thoroughly convinced that obedience is a virtue that, Even though someone new was in charge, they still felt obligated to do as they were told, even if it meant that violently oppressing their own kinsmen. But what may be even more disturbing, but indisputable, is the fact that many millions of people in history have assisted in their own extermination because authority told them to. For example, during the how do I put this? Because I don't want to use that word. During the transportation of people to the work camps, Arbeid macht vrij is what was pasted in letters above the gates, which were, by the way, open. Because people would go there voluntarily to these working camps. Why? You actually got more food in the working camps than you got outside of them. Right? So, for example, during the transportation of people to the working camps, many hundreds of thousands of Jews on their own power boarded the cattle cars of the very trains that would take them away to their deaths without trying to hide, run away, or resist. Why? Because those pretending to be authority told them to. While it was no doubt true that they were not all aware of exactly what lay in store for them at the other end, they still handed themselves in to the custody of a machine that obviously meant them harm. Yes, he's got a point there too. I mean, it was very well known. I mean, they saw it coming since 1933 and before, you know? How many years of propaganda do you need to get it that you're the one, you know? There is a certain... Oh, 57. Alright, we should stop it here and continue here next week. So, let's see. Chip boat sales skyrocket on East Coast due to cold weather and large snowfall amounts. Authorities are worried about cabin fever with thousands of people jumping into snowbanks daily. The mayor has implemented a ban on snowbanks diving within Boston. Yeah. Alright, so who's in the chat room anyway? Cracker. Haven't seen you around in a long time. Did he mention anything? What's up, buddy? How you doing? Dan is in the chat room. JJ. A lot of J's. Like Joe Friday. And Jules. 3 times. Oh, that's why so many J's. Lady Pitbull. Welcome. Lumper Deedle. You're a bit late. Road Dog. Thanks for the input. Vince seems to be AFK. Yota and Kevin and one and all. Thanks for listening. See you guys next time. Take care.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific